and these cascading attacks on European soil by ISIS operatives who are often, in many cases, in fact in most cases, young men who came out of the prison system of Belgium or France. In the case of France, the Kouachi brothers were orphans who were raised by the French state, very much a product of the French state. You have this confluence of factors that is causing people in France and in other countries in Europe to really warn of a reversion into a kind of fascist atmosphere, certainly authoritarianism. Now, France is currently under emergency law. I think Francois Hollande, the socialist president, has implemented a number of measures that Marine Le Pen, the leader of the National Front Party of the far right, a formerly anti-Semitic party that's transmuted anti-Semitism into Islamophobia, has been calling for. So the Socialist Party is doing what the National Front had wanted for a long time, especially these very sweeping surveillance measures which give French authorities the power to raid homes, to conduct wiretaps. The emergency law has been put into place until France's war on terror ends. It has outlawed protests. More crucially, the Socialist Party, under the watch of Prime Minister Manuel Valls, President Manuel Valls, is embracing a kind of austerity and waging the rights attack on labor unions and sort of deregulating protections for labor unions. And this has led to massive, really exciting development, something that has taken inspiration from the Occupy movement here, from the protests in Greece, even from the Arab Spring, which are these weekly protests of young people, mostly college students, they take space. They take, like, the Place de la République, where the Je suis Charlie demonstrations took place, and they just stay there and they camp out and they're demanding an end to austerity. But a lot of interesting things are happening, because for the first time you're seeing young people kind of break through this barrier of fear. And of course the barrier of fear has been established through the war on terror and the war against ISIS. What is ISIS? ISIS, to me, just to put it really simply, maybe it might be too crude for those of you who have more expertise, represents not the radicalization of Islam, but the Islamicization of radicalism. Radicalism used to be a secular, especially in Europe. Radicalism was a secular movement. In the 1970s, throughout Europe, way more terrorist attacks were carried out than now. And they were carried out by secular groups like the Baader-Meinhof gang, the RAF, the IRA, across the board. Now we're seeing them carried out by Islamic extremist groups, but by young men who are very much European. So what's behind that? The official journal of ISIS, Dabiq, introduced a really revealing theory, or actually I would call it a strategy, in its February issue right after the Charlie Hebdo massacre, attempting to explain what the strategy behind the Charlie Hebdo massacre was. The article is called Extinction of the Gray Zone. And in this article, the author, who is clearly a very experienced ISIS ideologue, high in the upper echelon of the organization, described the gray zone as the area in the West where coexistence takes place and where Muslims are able to actually thrive as Muslims and coexist among other Westerners. ISIS said that in order to advance the Islamic State, the gray zone has to be eliminated or extinguished. These Muslims have to know that there's no place for them in the West. They can only take sanctuary within the Islamic State, whose base is in Raqqa and Mosul in Iraq. And so the way to do that is not by going out and encouraging them to leave, by enticing them, although there are propaganda videos that do that, but to actually stage spectacular attacks on targets of symbolic significance across the West to provoke extremist elements from the other side, right-wing, native European elements, to push Muslims out. In other words, to propel Islamophobia, to push Muslims out so they have to take sanctuary within the Islamic State. And that's what was, in my view, behind the Charlie Hebdo attack, the Paris attack, and the Brussels attack, and they've achieved their goal. It appears very much that they've achieved their goal. If you look at what's happened in Brussels, for example, Vlaams Belang, and by the way, I started a project at Alternet, the online publication, called the Gray Zone Project, with the objective of defending the gray zone from this confluence of antagonists, of extremists, not just Islamic extremists, but Jewish and Christian extremists, and yes, atheist fundamentalists who want to destroy the gray zone and force us to live in a black and white world. In one episode we saw that we reported on in Belgium after the recent attacks in Brussels was a website started by Vlaams Belang, the extremist right-wing party, which has been, increasingly driving the debate in Belgium about the place of Muslims. They set up a website encouraging people to report on the religious practices of their Muslim neighbors and to put their names up and their addresses and to actually individually sanction Muslims in their own communities. Vlaams Belang has also encouraged a kind of what they call a reconquista or a reconquest, under the kind of influenced by the notion that Europe is being conquered by Arabs, is being conquered by Islam, and so they have attempted through their activists and through football hooligans like the Casuals to invade the neighborhood of Molenbeek, which is a Muslim-heavy neighborhood outside Brussels, and to actually purge Molenbeek of its Muslim residents. And this march was stopped by left-wing activists who were then attacked by thugs and attacked by police. And then the casual thugs, there's this soccer gang called the Casuals, marched through the middle of Brussels under police guard. And we're seeing this in city after city in European capitals. I was recently in Helsinki, and I watched 1,000 far-right activists, including hardcore neo-Nazis, skinheads with bomber jackets on, marching with clubs through the middle of Helsinki, holding torches, chanting, borders, borders, defend our borders, under police guard. And when anarchists attempted to interrupt the march, they were fired upon. They were fired upon with FN 303 bullets, which are bullets that explode in front of you and scatter shards of plastic into your face. That was the first time in Finnish history it had ever happened. This march ended at a cemetery just outside downtown Helsinki, where the war dead, the dead of World War II veterans were buried. These were men who fought alongside and with the Nazi SS. And the far-right demonstrators honored these World War II veterans who were allied with Nazi Germany. And this is, you see this in Eastern Europe, increasingly in places like Latvia, but you're seeing it in Finland, which made a tactical alliance with the Nazis. And just a very similar narrative across Europe and increasingly in our own politics about the demographic threat. The threat of, one, a demographic winter. White Europeans and white people in general are not making enough babies, and Muslims are having lots of babies. And not only that, the migrants have come to rape white women. And that's influenced a lot of this vigilantism. One of the most popular viral videos right now for this movement, the right-wing anti-immigrant movement, both in the U.S., which has really gotten behind the Trump campaign, and in Europe, is called Open Borders. And it's an allusion to the open legs of white women, and it makes constant references to dark-skinned men bombarding the shores of Europe to rape white women, and Donald Trump stars in the film. He's warning about strong men coming to Europe to do horrible things. And it recalls a certain narrative from our own history in the South in the U.S., but it also recalls a narrative that was spun out by the Zionist movement in historic Palestine. The importance of a Jewish state. A Jewish state requires a demographic majority of Jews, and that requires the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous population, their warehousing and exclusion, in order to keep Israel Jewish. And so the concept of a demographic majority or a demographic threat, the threat of the Palestinian woman, mostly Muslim, birthing children, being a greater threat than violent terrorism, emanates from Israel, particularly under its most right-wing government in history, which has allied itself with Marine Le Pen and allied itself very much with the far right in Europe. It's a really interesting development. The leader of Austria's, I think I'll get the name in German wrong, but it's the far-right Austrian party founded by neo-Nazis, was just welcomed by the Likud party in Israel on a semi-official visit and was hosted at Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Museum. This is a party that for decades has denied the Holocaust and has now come to Israel to say, we acknowledge it, our problem is your problem, our problem is the Muslims. And so you see these alliances coming together to destroy the gray zone, to extinguish the gray zone. And it works for Israel too, by the way. When you saw Netanyahu appear in this film, what was he doing? He was encouraging the Jews of France to leave. And they answered him by singing the French national anthem, like, we actually want to stay here. Because that is really the underlying logic of Zionism. Just as it's the underlying logic of the Islamic State, that all the Jews of the diaspora have to gather in a Jewish state, which is kind of a Spartan fortress state, just like the Islamic State will be. And so they have to be encouraged to leave. So the environment has to become uncomfortable. How do you do that? Encourage anti-Semitism. Who is encouraging anti-Semitism right now? ISIS, Islamic extremists. So there is an objective collusion there, not a direct collusion. This is not a conspiracy theory. There's an objective collusion, as Pierre Zawi alluded to in this film. So just leave it there, and I think the message of the film is that the gray zone is shrinking. And I welcome any questions or comments.
I think the difference between you we need to unpack among ourselves about what the attacks are, and there's very, very serious attacks going on right here in New York. In Jewish Voices for Peace, we're working very hard to defeat this bill that's in the New York State Assembly that's going to probably come out of the committee saying that it will literally be illegal to support BDS in New York City. So the question then becomes how this kind of Islamophobia is transferred into a different type of milieu. Trump, of course, is an example of it, but also Sanders' speech was an example of some things maybe positive that are going on, and positive things that are going on both among young people in progressive communities. So maybe we could talk a little bit about the strategy. I would like to talk a little bit, and you probably know more than I do, about the strategy of the Zionists in the United States. How does this cohere into a coherent strategy? Is it coherent, or is it something like they just pick and choose?
Yeah, I wrote a piece on Alternet recently about where I saw the strategy going. In many ways, I experience it in kind of an intimate way, because every day I wake up and there's some new. I look at my Twitter notifications to see what the new smear about me is. And as I said before, the debate is over. The pro-Israel lobby does not want to have debates. They don't want to discuss the facts. They actually are pretty open about their agenda, and it's to shut down the speech of their opponents, to actually criminalize. I really believe their ultimate agenda is to criminalize all opposition, which means not only criminalizing BDS, but starting to, waging an all-out attack on progressive social movements. Because BDS, what is it? It's just Palestine solidarity. What is Palestine solidarity? Like, who are the people behind it? It's like many of the people in this room. It's an amalgamation of left-wing Jews, of Muslim and Arab immigrants, of increasingly you're seeing African Americans and Latinos getting interested in it, and you're seeing coalitions that are not just that are coming together on campus about challenging mass incarceration, about doing divestment drives around fossil fuels. And these coalitions represent the future of progressive social justice organizing. These coalitions really are a big part of Bernie Sanders' base right now. And it's a base that will go beyond his candidacy. Right. So if you look at what's happening in the UK with the attack on Jeremy Corbyn, which is, I think, where the Bernie Sanders campaign needs to go if and when it ends as a presidential campaign. because Corbyn's real success is this group momentum, which was his ground game, his kind of grassroots movement that made him the labor leader. And it is an incredible coalition of mostly young people and working class people. It's the leading edge of the attack against Jeremy Corbyn is the pro-Israel lobby in the UK and elements within labor that are allied with it who are really using anti-Semitism, the issue of anti-Semitism, to reinstall somebody like Tony Blair. And Tony Blair is behind a lot of it. I mean, these are Blairite figures. One of the major people leading the attack is Jonathan Friedland in The Guardian. But you saw the Labour Party propose loyalty oaths for new candidates. They would have to basically sign a pledge that they're against racism, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. Well, that sounds great until you have to actually define what they are. And the way that anti-Semitism is being defined by these Labourites who are opposed to Corbyn is anti-Zionism. So we saw the regents of the University of California recently adopt a definition of anti-Semitism that equates it with anti-Zionism, which means doesn't matter if I say the Shema and every day that if I observe Shabbat, if I say the Kaddish for my dead ancestors, none of that matters. It doesn't matter if I disagree or agree with Moses to them. All that matters is that I have to agree with King Bibi in order to be a good Jew. And if I don't, I'm not even a Jew. Remember, these are Gentiles deciding who is a Jew and who isn't a Jew according to this definition. It's very dangerous. But that will be a precedent. They'll try to get other universities to adopt that definition. It's a speech code. And you see a lot of conservatives denouncing speech codes, right? And getting all upset about the PC thugs on campus and getting upset about the protests against microaggressions and protests for safe spaces. The pro-Israel lobby is attempting to define the entire campus as a safe space for exclusively pro-Israel Jewish students to be free from criticism of their politics and to be free from any activism opposing Israeli apartheid, which they've linked to their identity. They consider it a microaggression. So, and by the way, Palestinians still can't get a trigger warning. But so they're adopting the language of the left in many ways. They're adopting the language of the campus left in many ways to defeat it. So that's part of the strategy. And then you have these bills that you mentioned. The bills, I don't fully understand all the details of the bills. We're trying to publish different, at Alternet, at our little gray zone project, we're trying to publish analyses of these different bills to understand how they differ. One bill in Indiana, I think, establishes a blacklist, and in Illinois it passed. It's in the legislature in Indiana. Establishes a blacklist of corporations. It proposes to establish a blacklist of corporations that divest from Israel or from their holdings in Israel, basically in McCarthyite fashion to pressure companies into avoiding acceding to divestment drives. But then you mentioned this bill in New York, which you said actually will criminalize BDS.
Well, in a
It's
sense
more
it
of the
will.
same as what you
Yeah.
just described.
What did you say?
It's more like what he's talking about.
Which is
Yeah.
a form
No,
of-
it's like the New York State is not going to be able to do business with any company that divests from.
Well, if you
But
read
it's
the
not.
bill-
They're not out of committees yet, so we don't even know exactly.
Of course, but we need to understand it. That's my only
Right.
point.
I think it
And-
needs to be,
and,
It doesn't criminalize it.
the more it needs to be exposed, and I mean it's an attack on free speech,
Yes.
and that's the hypocrisy of the Je suis Charlie movement, is that they claim to be representing free speech, but who is Charlie? And these bills are an attack on those who cannot be Charlie, who don't identify with Charlie, and on their speech. It's free speech for some, and I just wonder where the liberals who say that they're against BDS, but they claim they're for free speech. It really is exposing the hypocrisy of a lot of liberals. You had a question?
No.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to discuss what's happening in this country, but I have a question back to the film. You had a very brief section exposing how Charlie Hebdo was racist, a couple of cartoons. But I remember right after the attack on Charlie Hebdo and so forth, there was a debate which I saw on the French far left And my impression was that the great majority of the French far left signed up with the Je suis Charlie movement or slogan, denied that the journal was in any way racist. Like somebody did in your film, well, they attacked everybody else, but but they certainly, from what I saw, they certainly concentrate on attacking the oppressed, and especially Muslims. So, but I was told by French far leftists that, oh, you don't understand the French sense of humor and so forth. I personally don't see how those, those caricature drawings of black people with thick lips and so forth, or Muslims with hooked noses like Nazi pictures of Jews, I don't see how that's not racist. But I kept hearing from people I thought might be sort of comrades on the French far left that, no, you don't understand.
Yeah, I heard that too, and it really annoyed me. It's always like, you just don't get our humor.
Yeah, right.
And actually, I meant to discuss this a little earlier, so I'm glad you reminded me. But there was a countercultural element or strain and heavy countercultural influence on Charlie Hebdo early on. And that kind of ended after 9/11, but especially as a new editorial regime came in. Olivier Sirhan was one of the cartoonists and writers who resigned in protest and wrote a really interesting piece. You can find it easily by Googling his name, on what went wrong at the magazine and how it turned Islamophobic. But you can just look at their recent cartoons, and I think the people you spoke to right after the massacre are really silent right now. And I think the PEN organization that honored Charlie Hebdo is silent right now. Salman Rushdie, who called everyone who wouldn't participate in that PEN event pussies, is silent right now because Charlie Hebdo has openly come out and declared its Islamophobia. After the Brussels attack, Charlie Hebdo published an article, an op-ed in English so that we could all see it and we couldn't deny that something was lost in translation, stating very clearly that the people who are responsible for the Brussels attack were not just Islamic extremists or ISIS, but were Muslims and all followers of Islam. And one of the people it singled out for responsibility is Tariq Ramadan, who actually I did a panel with about this film. And it said, he won't be shooting up offices with an assault rifle, but he's essentially creating the political space for that to happen. So if that's not Islamophobia, you have to argue that there's no such thing as Islamophobia, which is something that I've seen people actually do. A new atheist writer from Ceylon who attacked this documentary, attacked it on the basis that Islamophobia is a myth. And there is the cartoon of Aylan Kurdi, who is the infant who washed up at Bodrum, on the shores of Bodrum in Turkey, who had come from Kobani, which was the Kurdish town on the front lines of the fight against ISIS, and washed up dead, and his photo became sort of iconic. Charlie Hebdo published a cartoon of him. When he grew up, he would be an ass grabber, and showed him like grabbing the asses of white women, playing on the the moral panic stirred up by the Cologne attacks. This is just one of a cascade of racist cartoons that you can find in Charlie Hebdo. And it's now overseen by a character named Reese, who owns 70% of the stock in Charlie Hebdo. And Reese has admitted on French national radio that he is an Islamophobe. He just said, yeah, I'm an Islamophobe. What? Another thing that I find ridiculous about Charlie Hebdo is if you're going to be a countercultural magazine, then don't take money from the government, especially a government that is enacting emergency regulations that are authoritarian. And that is what happened after the Charlie Hebdo massacre. So I find the magazine to be reprehensible, but that was almost peripheral to what this documentary was about. This is about how Charlie is defined in France and who are the people who couldn't participate in those protests, why, and what happened to them.
I remember when I was still in high school at the time, but there were some riots in Paris in like maybe 2005 and 2006. There was, I think, if I remember right, there was an Algerian French boy who was being chased by the police, and he ran into an electrical fence, and he was electrocuted, and he died. And there were some massive demonstrations. At the time, they were calling it the French Intifada and things like that. I remember at that time, very little of that outrage about French racism was articulated in like Islamic kind of terms. What changed so that now when you see these kinds of acts of outrage, it's no longer mass demonstrations that are largely secular. It's these like 2 or 3 crazy guys shooting people and flying ISIS flags and things like this.
Yeah, that's a great question. The riots outside, I think it was 2005, outside Paris there was not a narrative about Islamic extremism from the right or from the left. And within the protests, there wasn't, you didn't see overtly religious displays. It was just a display of outrage. I think there are so many factors, and I really don't have a good answer to the question, except that one factor, which was cited by Michel Sibony in this documentary, who is basically the leader of the French version of Jewish Voice for Peace, is that France remains heavily involved in interventions in the Middle East, from Libya, which has become kind of a base of ISIS or ISIL, to Syria, where it got its kind of symbolic bombing campaign of Raqqa after the Paris attacks. And the transformation of parts of Iraq into strongholds of ISIL have also, just the general atmosphere of Islamophobia, how it's worked its way into the mainstream, has cast the entire French immigrant population under a net of suspicion, and it's been a very effective way of ramping up a surveillance regime and actually calling for getting into the mosques and getting into the prisons and getting into the communities. And it's happening here under the banner of Countering Violent Extremism, or CVE. In many ways, it's pitting Muslims against each other, the good Muslims versus the bad Muslims who won't participate in these government programs. So there are so many factors, but after 9/11, remember, in the U.S., Islamophobia did not peak after 9/11. It peaked according to an Ohio State University poll, it peaked after the killing of Osama bin Laden and the celebrations that ensued. And that took place against the backdrop of an Obama presidency where the president was demonized as a secret Muslim. That was a great way for Islamophobes to kind of puncture the mainstream with their narrative. The clash of civilizations narrative has really worked its way into the mainstream since 9/11, but it's taken years and years and years, and so I suspect in France it was part of a process. And now we've reached a point where, as I said, radicalism has been Islamicized. And we are seeing these small cells carry out massive attacks that have a gigantic political effect. But you can't see the riots in the same context as those attacks. You have to see the riots in the context of the youth protests that are taking place right now, and of the kind of organizing that Muslims are doing in France, where they're trying to form coalitions with Roma, with dissident Jews, and with other groups that feel marginalized. When I was on that speaking tour, for the first time in history, a mass meeting took place on Islamophobia that involved members of mainstream French anti-racism groups, members of the Green Party, members of the Communist Party, and it was sponsored by Attac, which is one of the major left-wing kind of non-profit organizations in France. So it was the first time you actually saw a coalition between left secular groups and Muslim groups against Islamophobia. The reason that coalition hadn't taken place is because of disagreements over social issues, specifically homosexuality, for example, because Muslims are more conservative on that issue. A writer from Charlie Hebdo named Caroline Forest actually attempted to stop the meeting on the grounds that these Muslim groups had protested against gay marriage, against same-sex marriage. And she managed to get the Green Party to withdraw its official sponsorship, although the members of parliament still showed up. And she's someone who considers herself, a liberal. So you can see you can see how, in many ways, Islam is being instrumentalized by those who are opposed to simply immigrants organizing and gaining influence in French society. I think that's the question. That's the real question, though. I see you.
I wanted to answer that.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I lived in Paris in the 90s, and there wasn't so much Islamophobia, but there was always anti-Arab
Anti-black
racism,
racism,
anti-black,
right.
anti-Arab, and especially in North Africans, they lived, in the Banlieue, like, and they're segregated, like, so kids that were born there, like, their parents were never integrated, but they just kind of kept quiet and worked. But the kids that were born there and grew up and, like, felt this discrimination were, it kind of went both ways, but there was definite anti-Arab racism and anti-black also, but they're more Arabs. And on your job application, you're supposed to include a photograph, so they don't hire you because you look North African.
Right.
So that was there in the 90s. So I think it was very easy to transfer that to Islamophobia, because it was there, like it just.
Yeah, I mean, it was the same in the UK. And, the rise of political Islam is a real thing in communities that have been sort of marginalized. So it's real. I mean, the collapse of Arab nationalism has also been a long process. I think the Arab Spring and the way that, just take Egypt as an example, the way that the Muslim Brotherhood was prevented from governing. Really, who was really behind crushing them? It wasn't just the Egyptian deep state, it was Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, which is fueling Islamic extremism, Salafi movements, fueling the rise of al-Nusra, and to some extent ISIS, saw the Muslim Brotherhood as one of its greatest threats because it was an Islamic-oriented group that was acting within a democratic context and could be seen as an alternative to the kind of Wahhabist and monarchist model that Saudi Arabia put forward, and it could threaten their stability. They funded the insurrection against Mohammed Morsi and funded the military junta of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to the hilt. And you see a retrenchment of the deep state in Egypt, where now over 40,000 people are in prison. Journalists across the border in prison. Even internationals are being killed by security forces, like Giulio Regeni, the Italian. The only alternative for young people in Egypt to the regime, to act against the regime, is violence. There's no political alternative, and so you see people turning to violence. And that regime has just been embraced by government after government across the West. I mean, it's being celebrated by, at least openly, by the Republicans in our presidential campaign. But Hillary and Bill Clinton welcomed Sisi to the Clinton Global Initiative and posed for photo ops with him. And I mean, what kind of message does this send to Muslims who are immigrants in the West? It says, we don't care about democracy for you. We don't care about your rights at all. And then, you try to come out and protest for Palestine, and we ban the protest. Then we send people to trial for organizing for BDS. What alternative are we going to leave you? It's feeding the radical narrative of Islamic extremism, this kind of vice and the kind of panopticon vision that the West has for Muslims. Yeah.
Just wanted to get your take on, I guess it's somewhat related because with Bernie's campaign in New York, I think he pretty clearly was taking on issues of Islamophobia, which I thought was really great. He was going around with Linda Sarsour and some other prominent Muslim American activists. I was wondering if you've seen some sort of evolution in Bernie's thinking on these issues or on Israel, because I don't know if you've seen, but there's pretty famous exchange with him and a protester at a speech in 2014 about Gaza. It seemed like he was pretty towing the Netanyahu line there. So I'm just curious.
That was a remarkable exchange. It was at a town hall in Vermont during Israel's assault on the Gaza Strip in 2014. Right. And his constituents start yelling at him, and he starts defending Israel and said, they have rockets raining down on... Basically, he said what Hillary Clinton said to him in the most recent debate and shouted them down. He was really angry and cantankerous, and it was ugly, and it led to many people at other subsequent public events confronting him about this moral blind spot, confronting him as a PEP, that term, progressive except for Palestine. And I was one of those who confronted him at a rally, or it was at a panel during the big climate change march, right before the climate change march in New York. He spoke before the panel. Chris Hedges was on it. Naomi Klein was on it. Kashama Savant endorsed him for president at this event. He hadn't yet declared. Two friends of mine actually got up in front of Bernie Sanders and held a banner and said Bernie supports, the slaughter of indigenous people in Palestine, or something like really strong. And then after the event, I approached him directly and I said, do you have anything to say about, your support for the attack on Gaza? Like, do you want to, have you thought about your position? And he looked at me and made clear eye contact and just walked away. I filmed it, so you can watch it on YouTube. It's not that interesting. But it is now because, he said some remarkable things in the last debate. It wasn't like all to my liking, but it's something I've never heard a presidential candidate say before. And he even rattled off the death count in the Gaza Strip, which was, just, I couldn't believe he did it. I'm sure many of you felt the same.
You, man.
Yeah, it wasn't. Obviously it wasn't because of me. I mean, Chris Hedges got. Yeah, I know I sound like so self-aggrandizing. But Chris Hedges denounced him from the stage, and he was getting a lot of pressure behind the scenes. It's just evidence that there is a very real, powerful movement that's totally changed the narrative on this issue. And he can't. Not only can he not deny it, but he realized that he could actually benefit from catering to it somewhat. And so
he might have won Michigan with a Muslim vote, so Muslim Arab vote.
Yeah, I mean, we did a piece on that at Alternet and interviewed some of the activists, the Arab American young activists who organized for Sanders in Dearborn, and they said, yeah, Hillary Clinton's terrible for us, but we're also Americans and we care about the economy, and he's better than her on that as well. We have to remember, first of all, that the first time Muslim Americans organized as a bloc was in 2000 for which candidate? Bush, for George W. Bush. My friend Samuel Arian was helped deliver Florida to Bush. The next thing he knows, he's in a federal prison because Bush turned his back on him, accused him of terrorism. So it didn't really work out for Muslims organizing for Bush. And that experience really was discouraging, and it took a kind of gestation period for Muslim Americans and Arab Americans to kind of, for a new generation to rise up and really find a candidate they could get behind and then mobilize as a bloc. I don't think Bernie Sanders was well known to Muslim Americans and Arab Americans. This is a recent thing. But once he became, it was right before Michigan that he became kind of well known. He started doing those events about Islamophobia. Linda came on later. But the fact that he would have her, introduce him in Washington Square Park is pretty remarkable. And he won Astoria. Steinway, is a big, traditional Arab American area. And he won Bay Ridge in Brooklyn. Those are, the Arab American areas. Arab Americans and Muslim Americans are the two groups Hillary Clinton has not pandered to. And Bernie Sanders offered them something pretty authentic. So I think it sets the stage. I mean, I think Sanders is still kind of in the J Street box. But this sets the stage for future candidates, particularly in safe Democratic districts, very progressive districts, congressional districts that are gerrymandered, to actually make Israel an issue for a more established Democratic candidate like Henry Waxman or someone like that, who line up with AIPAC. Right now, there's liberation seders taking place in Berkeley, where young Jews are actually, they've shut down parts of Berkeley right now in protest against the Jewish Federation Seder. Jewish Federations is really the representative of the Jewish establishment. And this is the group called If Not Now that Bernie Sanders' Jewish outreach director helped found. So this is a small part of the coalition that he represents. So I think Bernie Sanders, when he leaves the stage, something's going to be left there that will have a powerful impact on this issue. in at least opening space for us to have these discussions. And, I can't wait to see all of the liberal Zionists, the Peter Beinarts, like take credit for the success of BDS in 10 years, after I'm like, panhandling or something. Anyway, that was a great question. Just one more thing. I was at a private event last night with two major Palestinian human rights defenders, Raji Sourani and Showan Jabari. Jabari is the head of Al-Haq in Ramallah.
Last week.
Yeah, and he was here last week. And Sourani is in the Gaza Strip Palestinian Center for Human Rights. He documents all of the atrocities that they've experienced. And they both spoke about because they were here for the debate, how remarkable it was to see Bernie Sanders say what he did. And by the end of the event, Jabari was wearing a Bernie pin. And these are guys who, when I spend time in Palestine, I don't know, I know you've spent time there. Palestinians don't really talk about U.S. politics because they don't expect anything from us. They're just like, it's another president who's going to bomb the crap out of us. This is the first time I've seen people from Palestine actually get interested in American politics. Anything else? Or can I go drink my face off?
Thanks so much for.
Yeah, thanks for doing this.
I just have to say, even it's like finals period and people are freaking out. That's why there wasn't a big crowd. But just having you speak and having like Amit and Farah like send out announcements to get people to know that this is happening at the law school makes a difference. Like it really does, even if people aren't coming because it's finals period. So
Yeah.
thanks for coming.
Thanks for doing this, and good luck on your finals for those of you who are students. I didn't like school very much. And one announcement: there will be a part 2. James Kleinfeld is going to release, and we'll publish it at Alternet. So look out for that. And